So I think I get us started. I see there's 104 participants so far. We're expecting some more, but I don't want to keep everyone waiting. So yeah, welcome to all of you. I'm very happy to be here with you. And on behalf of Rhonda and myself, I would like to start by expressing some gratitude. Gratitude to Inga for the initiative for this event. Gratitude to David, Catherine, Liz, and the IMS staff for making this possible. And gratitude to all of you, each of you individually, all of you together, for joining us. There are so many other things one might decide to do on a Friday evening. And racism is such a painful topic now. Why come here? I think you all came. Rhonda is here, I'm here. Because we think this is something to look at. We are convinced that this is something to face based on a Dharma framework. Something to face from the perspective of our practice, to make it part, integral part of our mindfulness practice. So I like to take a moment of just arriving and just being with the beauty of our wholesome intention. Looking at our mind, just aware of the wholesome quality of the mind that wants to face this problem. The beauty of the mind at this present moment. And allow me to express things in my word, and you see if that resonates with you. Our willingness to face, recognize the suffering, the huge amount of unnecessary suffering caused by racism. And our willingness to alleviate the causes of that suffering. And we are inspired, we can be inspired by that vision. How would it be if human beings can live together without the disease of racism? Such a beautiful vision. And we want to make this our practice. We want to integrate this into our path to liberation, related to our mindfulness practice. Thank you. That was the Four Noble Truths, eh? Naughty Analayo. Yeah.
Thank you.
So what is going to happen now, as we have hopefully arrived and hopefully haven't bored you too much with my little interlude, I have this wonderful book from Rhonda. It's really the best book on the topic I read. And I will read out some short passages and then ask Rhonda to expand or put into context, elaborate. And that will go on for maybe an hour. And after that, Rhonda will offer a guided meditation to round off the day. So let me start with the first passage I chose. And Rhonda doesn't know what I'm going to read. Not one of us can escape from engaging in ongoing, often subtle practices of racialization or race making. We all do. We attach notions of race in ad hoc, culturally, and regionally defined ways to places as well as bodies. In our minds, neighborhoods, states, and even continents are often implicitly or explicitly racially identified. And we perform an act in ways that reveal our investment in maintaining these notions of race and racial difference. What does it mean to say that a space feels white? It means that the space has been shaped by a culture that has privileged the experiences of white people. It can be characterized by hyper-individualism over collectivism, entitlement to material comfort, if not luxury, in a world of presumed scarcity, and a sense of disconnectedness from the broader context in which we live. So much for my first reading. And now the question, what do we do about that? Where comes mindfulness in?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that, for the reading and for this question about what we can do about the embeddedness I think we all are as we move through the world. We live in a world which has made real this idea of race and its consequences, which is really the most important piece of it, I think, right? It's the fact that, if this idea didn't have any purchase or any impact on how we experience opportunity, access to resources, if it didn't matter how, in terms of how we were met in the world, maybe this whole, all of it would just kind of disappear. But I think by virtue of the fact that we all know something about how race matters, that we cannot, I think, we sort of avoid addressing it at our individual and maybe interpersonal and collective peril. So here we are. It's a feature of our lives. We didn't create it. And as mentioned, right, we can find ourselves associating or feeling in some sense a racial quality to bodies, to spaces, to ways of moving, the way people move. There's so much of that. So what do? We bring mindfulness in.
Yeah.
Right? Noticing our, one way to do that is to really notice our reactions, if you will, to other bodies, other beings, places that on some level trigger or give us the felt sense in the body that we might, if we pay attention, notice is associated with something we've been taught about race and or racism. Sociologists will say that it's the fact that race has mattered so much and that there are these hierarchies associated with race. We call racism, bias, colorism is a form of that, where we're rank ordering people based on the degree of lightness or darkness in one's skin. And again, they're proxies for race, one's accent, immigration status, right? So this is really opening up a really big topic, but really the question really at the heart of it is, what can we do about it? And I do think mindfulness can help us in many, many ways. But starting with helping us really get to know our mind and body and spirit, get to know how it is that we relate to those aspects of our experience that signal something about race and racism. So again, for me, I think mindfulness always is this beautiful support for starting right where we are. And just noticing, exploring what are our habits and patterns and conditionings around race and racism. And, from that place, because again, we can talk about it and we can read about it and we can study it. But of course, mindfulness is an invitation for us to come home to the body and come home to what we know in our bones about all of these things. And from that place of kind of openness to just noticing if we're getting attached, for example, to a certain type of body, type of place that in some ways is associated with a certain type of race or narrative about race and who belongs there. Or if we're getting aversive, right? Noticing, again, often as your teachings have helped us understand, Venerable Analayo and so many other teachings of, the underlying Buddhist traditions, which give rise to what we call mindfulness, right? So mindfulness, of course, being present, paying attention to what is arising. We'll notice if we're paying attention that associated with these ideas of race are, these pleasant and unpleasant feelings, right? Or a kind of a habit of being in a fog of I don't know, ignorance, right? A neutral that can be associated with some, in our own experience, might be kind of neutral around race, like because of the way we're embodied and the contexts that we've lived in, we don't see or feel very much around race. So we may stay in a fog of not knowing, right? And so from that place of like noticing what's happening in the body when I am encountering things around the notion of race, and noticing the range of things and the way different sensations show up in different places and in different environments, different, social locations. And then noticing again, how those underlying feeling tones can lead to habits of attachment, aversion, staying ignorant, what in Buddhist language is called often the kind of root defilements, right? Those underlying things that kind of can lead to suffering because we're clinging to something that feels good, being around these types of people, or clinging to this idea of I don't want to be around those people. I'd rather have a wall up against those people, or at least I'm going to be okay with a conversation about maybe we need a wall. I'm not going to fight against it, which is a subtle way of being in complicity with that. So the bottom line is, those are just some of the examples. If we bring mindfulness, this kind of deep mindfulness, to bear on our own experience, right? To just being present, what's coming up for us? Where is that thought, right? The narrative, the analysis that we want to, the argument we want to make. Can we pause that a little bit and feel our way underneath the cognitive work, underneath the argument, underneath the feeling that we have to do this or that right away, and create spaciousness for just sensing into what's happening in the body as a feeling tone, as a sensation, and how am I relating to that? Am I attaching to that? Am I churning it? Am I sort of avoiding it and moving on, distracting myself from it so I don't have to address it? Mindfulness then can really be a support for getting to know our own heart, mind, and body in relationship to race and racism. And from that place, we can discern how to act more skillfully in response to minimize its harms.
Oh, that was just so beautiful, Rhonda. Wow. You mapped out the whole four satipatthanas in relation to racism. Well done, sure. It is the skin of the body in the usual situation. The key is Vedana, sensation, feeling tone. Like, no like, don't care. Like, no like, don't care. And that's so easily to catch. And then see what's happening in the mind. And not just at the conscious level of thought, but what are my assumptions? What are the underlying tendencies that kick in throughout evaluations that then I pretend are evaluations of what's out there? Instead, they come from right here. And how does all of this relate to the construction of identity? It's the key of the Dharma, not self. How I create a certain identity and I surround myself with other whites and I feel very comfortable. We're all on the same wavelength. Person of color coming in, something is not fully flowing along, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And not, I mean, on the one hand, I mean, I think it's beautiful we have these practices to support us in becoming more aware of these very, very subtle dynamics that we are experiencing as we move through the world, or maybe witnessing. How many of us have witnessed some of these things? You know, we're having a conversation, everything's fine. A person comes along who, in some way, shape, or form, signals a difference from the norm that we expect in the space. We may have witnessed people chilling the conversation, or, you know, holding the body in a certain more defensive kind of way, literally turning away from or moving out of the space. And so, you know, a lot of this is just really, it's disrupting or inviting inquiry into how we tend to experience some of these dynamics. Do we pay attention? Do we notice? Do we habitually not notice? Do we inquire? Do we feel we have permission to open up conversation about what just happened? Because often we don't feel like we have permission, right? So that's another very subtle way that we get sort of trained around the norms and normativity, right, of race making. You know, there's some silence is a big, big, big part of how we maintain race and racism and the production of racialized experience. Just being silent. When we see something, we notice it, we go along without challenging it. And so it's, in a way, I think it's easier said than done to disrupt these patterns, actually. I think we have to have a little bit of kind of a healthy willingness to be engaged in something that's not as easy as is advertised, right? You know, it's not like we can just decide we want to not be affected by these things, because it's, you know, part of it is that we're constantly being bombarded with images, with kind of subtle invitations, rewards, ways we're rewarded for playing a certain role and complying, being silent, not raising these issues, not making waves, and subtly maybe punished on the other hand. And again, back to pleasant and unpleasant. Does it feel good to be, you know, kind of treated like you're the problem because you raised this issue? No. So that's a training. I'll maybe be silent the next time because it feels good to be accepted, to be included, even if we're included in a group that is excluding other people. So really creating a space where we can, you know, have permission, give ourselves permission, give each other permission to look at these very subtle dynamics by which race continues to be kind of produced, socially created and produced. And as you know, I don't know if this question was on your list, my dear Bhante Venerable Analayo, But in my book, I talk about sociologists who have identified this idea of racecraft, that we can create race. And, the provocative suggestion by the sociologists who've come up with this term is that, we're creating race because we've been so often formed by and informed by racism. In other words, we know something about racism. We know about the history of it. We whether we feel we've been involved in it personally or not, we've learned something about it. And the knowledge of racism, the witnessing of, disparity in terms of health outcomes, income, criminal prosecution, all the different ways we continue to see the manifestations of racism today, systemic racism, educational outcomes differences, and on and on and on. The idea is that by seeing the evidence of racism, it is a very subtle kind of push to promote looking for race, because we have been trained to understand it as socially relevant. And so again, and of course, human beings, we want to be in advance of any potential threat. And racism is threatening to our sense of well-being, right? Because one of the ways that racism shows up is in greater vulnerability of those people to violence, to harm, to all the disadvantages of these systems. And so it's sort of understandable that in a world in which racism is real and outcomes differ depending on our way in which we're racially identified in a space where race matters, then we're going to be looking for race. And it's by looking and acting in ways that make it real. Oh, yes, I see one over, that we continue to create it. And it's this sort of vicious and not particularly virtuous cycle.
Yeah, you said that it's difficult, but I think in the kind of audience we are here, with this background in mindfulness training and even Vipassana meditation, I actually think it is just a question of opening the perspective, because the tools are already there. And it is a problem that I experience also in general, coming from a background of having been an Asian Buddhist for a long time and then coming to the West, and this separation between what in the canonical scriptures are the internal and the external dimension of mindfulness. And the sense that mindfulness means just I, me, myself, sitting there on the cushion and looking inside. And having this, I don't know, you call this what the horses have by their eyes, these kind of things, and not watching anything outside.
Those blinders.
Yeah, blinders.
Mm-hmm.
That's not mindfulness. That's focusing. Mr. Shaw. Mindfulness is open, she's receptive.
Mm-hmm.
And so this, what you so beautifully laid out, is really an invitation of dropping the blinders and opening up the scope of practice of our mindful engagement. And this is not contrary to the path to awakening, it's contributive to the path to awakening. Because we learn about ourselves. We learn about our Vedanas, how they trigger us, our biases, and we learn about the construction of the sense of identity that directly feeds into not self.
Exactly. Right.
Very powerful.
Yes, you're right. It is with this in this community, and this is one of the reasons why, for me, I'm a lawyer, a law professor. I studied sociology. I've been teaching about race and racism and history and the legal history through which the law contributed to the maintenance of racial hierarchy and the creation of it, and just really was completely on the side of really white supremacy in the United States for most of our history, actually. So teaching about that as a kind of a knowledge, as a discipline, as a cognitive exercise in the ways that it was taught to me, right? And when I went to law school, when I studied sociology, we were taught to learn these theories and read these cases and be able to argue about the relevance, but we weren't taught to bring a deeper level of awareness to how we were relating to this information. We weren't taught to notice the way that our emotions were being triggered as we heard this information, or were invited to make arguments on this side and then make arguments on the other side. And, in the legal pedagogical space, when we're teaching about the skillfulness of becoming a lawyer, there are so many ways that it was being approached that seemed to not to appreciate the multidimensional challenge that we're faced as a room of people from different places and experiences and different types of bodies who have lots of different, for whom this all matters in very real world ways, even apart from what kind of grade we might get or how skillful we might be in an argument. We're human beings in the process of that learning. And so I, of course, as a student myself, I went to university in Virginia, and I came into my experience of education in the United States in the period that we know of as, the kind of post-civil rights era in the 20th century, right? I was born in 1967. I like to just go ahead and name that year. And born in the South, the southern part of the United States. And so I was born in a particular context where right where I lived, the entire neighborhood was constructed on these ideas of white supremacy. So everything we're talking about is not abstract for any of us, actually. And that's part of what we're talking about, how to bring that courageous and kind of just clear seeing, right? Just, I can look at this. I can look at how my own life experience in the particular place that I live, in my case, in the South, the schools I went to, the first school I went to in the early 1970s, although it was, some years after the Supreme Court had announced the Brown versus Board of Education decision that said basically we need to integrate, desegregate these schools, separate but equal, violates the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, right? That decision in the 1950s opened up, the possibility we could have this conversation. If we had not remade the world, this wouldn't be possible, period, point blank. So change happened as a result of changes in law, but they really literally impacted my life. I mean, again, I was raised in a neighborhood that had been, designed for people who look like me and only people who look like me. And so other Black racialized people were the only people around me in the state of North Carolina, in the city where I lived. The school I went to was an all Black school. And again, even though Brown versus Board has said, no, that violates the Equal Protection Clause, it wasn't until more law and more fights and more struggle that the schools started to actually integrate, and opportunities for me to ultimately go to university and learn were presented. But when I got to university, predominantly white university, University of Virginia, a fine school in many ways. Again, I wouldn't be here if I hadn't been able to go there, in all likelihood. But I was being trained there at a place that was created, founded by Thomas Jefferson, one of the founders of the United States, one of the, the author of the Declaration of Independence, was the founder of the university that I went to, also a slaveholder for all of his adult life. So embedded in the university that I went to school, like many people who are on this call or listening in here, if you lived and grew up in the United States, anywhere near this era, and even now, right? We live in a world that was completely formed and created by racism. And we've seen some changes in how it has shown up and impacted us, such that possibility has opened up because of agitation, political action, legal change. But none of that is easy. And the temptation to kind of put the genie back in the bottle, put people back in their places, is a feature of societies that are undergoing social transformation. So in the midst of the change, we're once again being met with new narratives about, why certain people's votes shouldn't matter, or why certain people shouldn't be allowed, certain types of people shouldn't be allowed to vote or immigrate or occupy positions of authority. Goodness knows one should never have been a president, et cetera. So we're in a time where we're being once again kind of invited back into, we're constantly being invited to kind of attach again. There's a new narrative or a new way of feeling comfortable with these ideas of who belong and who doesn't, who belongs and who doesn't. So yes, thank goodness we are in this kind of community of practice and learning, where we have the tools and underlying ethical commitments, I want to say that as well, to bring to bear on all of this. And I say thank goodness because all of us, we are in a world where the effort, the struggle to kind of divide us and to kind of get us recommitted to hierarchy is ongoing. It can happen wherever we are. We could be sitting here. Emails could be coming in right now trying to impact how we think about all of these issues. So my hand goes over my heart, because I know that this is not an easy time around all of this. And I know that just to be even more candid, there is kind of an organized effort to divide us, to polarize us, to uplift again some of these old narratives. And people are being harmed as a result. Our entire democratic system is being destabilized as a result. And all the good things that we might want to do, whether it be climate change or better health care or more effective and humane immigration policies, you name it, the things that we might want to do as a culture and a country, a political community, are impacted by how well we can meet the challenge and how better we can respond to disrupt the invitation once again to kind of organize our thinking and our politics in ways that support racial hierarchy. So here we are.
I want to take that up and right away jump to another point in the book. I dropped something else, but there's something that I find very relevant to what you said, which also helps me to understand better what we are dealing with. Much of the emotion that motivates racial reactivity across a wide range of scenarios is some form of fear.
Yeah.
And I want to add another one, but I want to afterwards take you up on that fear, because that thing's a very important observation.
Mm-hmm.
We have lacked the consciousness necessary to see our potential together and to lift ourselves up to a new plane for being in relationship with one another in ways that do not depend on power over, but rejoice in power with. These 2 points, the fear and this shift from power over to power with.
Yeah. Right. So these are, I think, really, really important points. And I want to just invite this spirit of inquiry around this. So first, to take the first part, how fear is so much a part of, what do we say? The kind of the mechanisms by which racism operates. And, some of the ways that we can be subtly and explicitly, right? There's a whole range of tactics. But if we realize that, and this does begin to link these two themes, the underlying fear, the politics of fear that underlies often, the invitation to reinscribe and to reorganize around themes of race on the one hand, but also what disrupts it or what could disrupt it might be the effort to understand better how to work collaboratively across lines of real and perceived difference to build coalitions through which we don't have to fear each other, through which we can learn how to trust each other and make real the promises and possibilities of this power that comes from our working together as opposed to our dominating each other. So sociologists will tell us that the temptation to categorize human bodies based on some sort of observable or other identity characteristic, right? Most across the world, the most universal categories that we create are around age and gender, even though what we do with age and gender varies, right? So sometimes we give more respect to the elderly, sometimes less, right? It varies. But you look around the world, you see that those are two of the characteristics that societies quite often in some way or another are classifying people and rank ordering in some way. But of course, we're creative human beings. So we don't limit ourselves to classifying based on identity. We are often classifying based on other, what can look like arbitrary characteristics. But in the United States, we've created this thing called race. And once we have these characteristics, these classifications, we quickly tend to create policies, practices, ideologies, stories, all kinds of things that reinforce the idea of a hierarchy of value and worth. And all of that, of course, allows and supports the application of force and power, right? The distribution of resources, right? We tend, in a society where there is surplus of any sort, right? There's profit to go around, there are resources to be distributed. Once we've come up with this idea of some are, better than others, then the maldistribution of resources will follow that. Well, if we just think about that, if that's happening, it's sort of understandable that that's a dynamic that feels threatening to like a soft-bellied carbon-based human being that just needs food and water and safety from violence. In other words, human beings are quite threatened by these practices. We know this. So there's fear that we might be, vulnerable to some harm in a world where hierarchy exists. And so again, given that we've inherited these hierarchies, we didn't, we were born in a world where right as soon as we're born, right on our birth certificates in the United States, somebody's given us a race. They've come up with something, they've looked at my skin color, right? And boom, there's a race attached. They don't do a test. It's not like a genetic test. They're looking at the skin color. The lawyers used some of the old cases describe the unscientific nature of race in America using the phrase an ocular test, meaning we just look at people and we just decide, right? But they try to use a fancy word like ocular, make it sound like it has some, but it's just looking at people. But if you know all this is going on and you know that as a result of that, I might have, more or less opportunity to accumulate resources. If we know that if we learn, as we do, as we age, our capitalist system has enabled the accumulation of wealth to run with these categories. So housing, equal in all other ways except differentiated by the race of the inhabitants in the United States is valued differently, right? Housing costs more in certain types of neighborhoods than others based on race. And that's just one example of how, again, there's these material consequences. Well, we then can feel vulnerable to sort of not being, to everything, from not getting enough resources, being treated with disrespect, not getting, the kinds of care that we might need if we're ill. In other words, there's some if we allow ourselves to feel our way into it, we know that there is a way in which there's so much on the line in a society that has really made race and racism a feature. We're all in it, and we're all, vulnerable to sort of all the reactivity that can come from the human perception of threat, right? Everything from just subtle discomfort to terror and fear. And when that's running in a culture, that can be manipulated as a source of power. That is to say, if I can make you afraid of, people who look like that person, right? Then I can manipulate you in ways that might serve my interests. So there is a way that racism has been used to support, right? Or it is about the accumulation of power, right? You cannot understand racism well in the United States if you're not willing to examine power. And the invitation to address racism is a reflection, an invitation to look at our relationship to power, its use and abuses, the normalization of power over people, especially those we have decided are less than, and the underinvestment in practices for bringing down the fear, recognizing our common humanity, and supporting our ability to develop the power, first of all, that we have within ourselves, our innate power that all human beings have to make a difference, but also that power to collaborate with each other and to shape the world positively as a result of that. So the fact that we are just these soft-bellied, carbon-based human beings that are, that are always trying to have our basic needs met, make us vulnerable to the consequences of racism in terms of, again, making resources available harder to get for some of us than for others. And therefore, it's kind of understandable, actually, once racism is running, it's very kind of you could see it almost like as a rational act to kind of try to ally with the dominant race, try to ally with dominance. So while, yes, our practices can support us in seeing a little bit more clearly when we're being invited into that dance, there is that ethical question. How do we want to respond to our own sense of disempowerment in a world, right, where we're not on top all the right? Who's in charge here? We're all like vulnerable. And so this is a way, has always historically been a way to help, kind of pre-organize our thinking about how we might get a little bit more resources. And so the idea of white privilege and the privileges associated with whiteness that have flowed through our culture since the founding. You could avoid being enslaved, yes. You could become a naturalized citizen if you were white. Other people could not. Since 1790, our first naturalization law, right? Privileged naturalization is something that whites could have, but others couldn't. And it goes on and on and on from there. And so the fear of being disrespected and disadvantaged is not irrational. That's what racism does. But there are ways to counter that if we can work together to lessen the impact of racism and create more support for all of us to thrive, more fairness, more justice for all of us. And that, I think, is what I'm hoping to inspire in the work that I do. And I just put my hand on my heart because, again, that part again is not easy to kind of maintain. To stay in the struggle for a justice that encompasses the we, like that really is not just about me and mine, that disrupts that narrative and just says, I want a world where we minimize suffering for everybody. That's what I think is the potential of bringing these practices into engagement with anti-racism, social justice, racial justice work. But it is, it's an ongoing challenge because there's a countervailing struggle always. And so we have to wake up each day. How do I want to be in relationship to all aspects of my life, including this dynamic that is trying to subtly invite me back into patterns and practices and complicity with domination and dominating other human beings? How do I want to be in relationship to that? How do I want to stand up? How do I link arms, right? And say, no, I'm going to stand up and amass that power with, as opposed to power over.
Yeah, it brings to my mind also the inner dimension of working with fear in a way. There's this powerful image of the Buddha being almost passing away, and before another important disciple passing away, actually. And his attendant Ananda is all like, oh my God, no. Who says, hey, take refuge in yourself. Take refuge in mindfulness. That's the only refuge we can have. So when we are faced with something we are afraid of, in this case, Ananda is afraid of losing his best friend and losing his teacher, or whether it is these patterns that you described where we are being tricked into fear in order to make us go along with certain power structures and certain things. There is always this possibility to step back and say, no, I can protect myself through mindfulness much better than I could through even becoming the president of this country, which is about the most powerful position I can think of right now. And if I stay stable, rooted, embodied, with this embodied mindfulness, I can become also a refuge for others, because they will see there's somebody who's not getting tossed around by the winds of. And for this reason, I really think this fear and power over power with these two, I think you have spotted key aspects of this whole question that we can really relate to the mindful working with racism. And this leads me on to another passage. We begin a crucial process capable of creating real change in the only place where we can be sure that real change can happen. Our own minds.
Yes, indeed.
We are mindful not only of our own experiences, but of those of the people around us as well. And we practice the mindfulness strong enough to resist the siren song of the world's confusion, separations, over-attachment to outcomes, and ability to live comfortably off the excess afforded by the systemic suffering of others. I think that really nicely brings together the direction we are heading right now.
Yeah. Start right where we are. Start with the one mind, the one body that we have some control over as we work with it a little more with humility. But starting with our own commitment to practice, our own commitment to noticing our own habits and conditioning, again, with kindness and with openness, catching ourselves when we might be drawn to take up the bait. And we might be drawn to, seizing on something that makes us feel a little bit better about ourselves and a little safer. but instead being able to take refuge in the practices, in these communities of practice, in the teachings, the Dharma itself. I mean, that is the ultimate invitation, and that should protect us. And I mean, I'm just the one to say that if we look at our history, we know that this requires something of us. This is where the practice is, again, that ethical underpinning and that call to live in alignment with what we are, the vows, if we've taken vows, the way we want to live, the way we want our actions to have impact in the world or not, right? Living with some integrity around that, again, is, it's, again, where people are living in the world, they're living in communities. And in this particular community of practice, we have a range of people listening. So some will be maybe have taken vows and maybe living in ways that really have completely support fidelity to these ethical commitments. But then some of us are living in the world, and we have children, we have colleges to think about, and a boss to manage. And therefore it can be, as we move through the world, a daily struggle. But this is why we come together. This is why we take time to deepen our practice. I mean, this is really what the practice is for. And so I really just have a lot of honor and respect to all those who are here, because again, this is not the mindfulness that's advertised of just like, we just sit and pause and then we have a quick burst of focus and well-being. This is okay, I really have to think about, how am I spending my money? How am I, spending my heart? Like, how am I, my body, where am I placing my body in relationship to these ideas of attenuating racism? Am I? What does racism really even look like in my experience? Because again, we don't live in a world where they've got the white and the black signs up around the schools. It's much subtler. And so how do we continue to kind of work with the personal, the interpersonal, and then the systemic and collective invitations to change the world in ways that minimize racism? Again, I do think these practices have us starting with right where we are and what we can do and how we can be together. And from that can flow changes in terms of the systemic and collective. But yes, and we can also find ourselves volunteering and, voting in certain ways and asking candidates certain questions about what they would do at the local, the state, and the federal level. In other words, this is about social engagement as well, insofar as we are moving through the world. And those can be difficult, right? We can be met with people who are angry, who disrespect us, who might even threaten us with violence because of the positions we hold. So I'm just trying to keep it real on that score, that, I think we are beautifully supported, obviously, by the practices and the commitments that we have. But they are not a panacea in the sense that they are not, they're not a plexiglass kind of box around which we won't feel maybe some of the vulnerability that can happen in the world when people try and physically come after us or target us for mistreatment because of the practices we've committed to or the views that flow out of those practices and the things that we want to do in the world. And so, like those who have struggled, on the front lines of social justice throughout human history. Because I do think it's important to remember we are creatures of many different types of lineages. But certainly, if we talk about this work, we are picking up the baton that our ancestors passed to us, because we're not the first people to look around and be kind of horrified about inequality, injustice, unnecessarily violence, and human disregard. So we pick up, right, where our ancestors, where the teachings, where our spiritual and other inspirational figures have brought us. They've helped us understand that we have work to do and a role to play. And then at some point, but we have to do what we can do with a certain ability to let go of tight, embrace, or, clinging to particular kinds of outcomes, including ultimately, I guess, and it pains me sometimes to say it, but I mean, I've seen violence as a result of the things that we're talking about. And we've seen violence in this country. January 6th was just one example. But if you were paying attention to the news, we know that violence is happening around us quite frequently around these issues of racial and other political differences. So I pray, actually, that those of us who stand up for these causes are safe, physically safe. But I want to say that part of what our practices can support us with reckoning with is the impermanence, obviously, of our lives in any event. And again, fierce heart for choosing to make the most of the moments that we have, knowing that our lives are precious, like all life, but not permanent. And the things that we do and the time that we have matters. So here we are.
Ties in directly with the next passage I wanted to read. Our practices of mindfulness and compassion prepare us to meet the patterns of oppression in our midst without becoming mired in them, without making that which we seek to redress more real than it really is. We do not have to remain stuck in notions of difference as we engage in the work to repair the harms that difference makes. It's just so beautiful. You want to just leave it stay there, or you have something to add?
Well, and I know we're about to kind of segue into practice, but I guess one thing is that I haven't really touched on is just, again, there are so many kind of worn grooves around these things, right? So this idea that there's white experience and there's Black experience, and it gets talked about as if it's all monolithic and you have privilege and you don't, and this and that. I really think that these practices are inviting us to just bring all of that into question, and to really recognize that, like, wow, right, open up, right, while race is real, it's not, I mean, it's socially real, it has these real consequences. It's not real in another sense. It's just a construct that we've made. And even to say that it's real in its social manifestations, be open to being like wrong about how we think about that, being open to disrupting some of the ways we kind of hold tightly to, what whiteness is and what Blackness is and what, AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander, and what's happening with Latinx and Native folk. In other words, some of the challenge can be because we care so much and because we see the harm that this is doing, that a part of our work then needs to be being more open to the way that our narratives about even racial victimization are not the whole story. And the way that we tend to think about racial identity as kind of, yes, it's a construction, but you have a race and you have a race. Well, again, if we look at those who are kind of in the in-betweens, people, or the folks whose embodiments and heritages partake of more than one of these so-called races, you know, in other words, there are people who are in this conversation who would identify, if you had to identify, perhaps as multiracial. And those identities help sharpen our ability to recognize, oh yes, even in terms of how it's showing up socially, what we think of as the landscape of race is not what we think. And really sort of inviting, again, being engaged in the effort to understand and diminish the impact of racism on us, but to do that without getting, you know, stuck in those narratives about that tell us we do already know what, you know, we already know how race is operating and who the problem person is. It's really about gentling the hard places and the places where we are tempted to, to once again create a new narrative. And so even those narratives about justice are an invitation through a mindfulness lens to keep waking up.
That's so beautiful that I don't want to say anything anymore.
And here's a good time for us to sit together. Thank you, my dear friend and teacher, Venerable Analayo, and thank you to everyone who has joined in this reflective conversation, this kind of practice, interpersonal, mindful conversation. What I'd like to invite is for us to engage in a practice here together, a lightly guided practice of formal meditation. So wherever we are, wherever you happen to find yourself, the invitation is to settle in as you would for a period of practice. For me, it's going to be a sitting practice. And however you happen to choose to bring the body into this moment of formal practice, take a moment to establish the body in the position of practice that is supportive for you in this moment. So becoming aware of the body in the posture that you've chosen. Feeling the points of contact between the body and the floor if you're in a seated posture, perhaps the feet on the floor, or the points of contact between the legs and the cushion beneath you. And beneath all of this, whether through a chair or a cushion or otherwise, allow yourself to feel the contact with the earth itself. So coming home to the sensations of just sitting and breathing, feeling the spaciousness of the body, the contours of the body, the skin that we're in, and the environment that is supporting us right here, right now. Perhaps allowing the attention to come into more intentional focus on the sensations of breathing. Perhaps in the next in-breath, noticing a particular place where you can feel the flow of the in-breath, maybe through the nostrils. Maybe you're feeling the expansion of the chest or the belly button region as the diaphragm expands to take in the breath. Feeling the torso collapse as you exhale. Just allow yourself for the next few moments to come home to these gentle sensations by which you know yourself to be breathing in and breathing out. And as the attention gently rests on the sensations of breathing, bringing this quality of mindfulness more strongly to the fore, feeling the presence, the sensation of being present, being alive, attending to the sense of spaciousness in the body as a whole as you breathe in and out. Letting the mind rest for the next few minutes on these sensations. And as we breathe in and out, perhaps now allowing the attention to identify any way in which the body might be feeling some of the resonances or reactivities to the conversation that you just experienced. So just notice if you're feeling anything in the body in the way of difficult emotion, a story that's come up for you or that you heard in our conversation, something that you question you wanted to have answered that has some sort of emotional feeling tone attached in some way to it. So the invitation is just to see how you are in this moment and to allow maybe just a gentle scan of the body to see where in your body you might be feeling some of the stickiness or the way in which that conversation that you just experienced, listened to, witnessed, might be creating some challenge for you. If it be so, you might also notice something else, maybe some positive emotion, some resonance, some warmth, ease. So the invitation is to gently scan the body Perhaps starting with the feet, coming up through the lower legs, knee regions, both legs, the thighs, lower torso. As we breathe in and out, the upper torso and the chest region, the region of the heart. Noticing the quality of the heart in this moment. And again, if there's sadness, heartbreak, anger, even rage, the invitation is to just allow yourself to feel what you're feeling. Maybe allow a word or two to come up to help in naming what we are feeling in this moment. Again, the feeling might be one of ease or even comfort or joy, whatever it might be. No right or wrong here. Inviting mindfulness of our emotions, the thoughts associated with the feelings that we have in the body, to become more present. And so if a whole story is coming up and many thoughts, the invitation is to just notice the river of thought, emotions. And perhaps to allow an image or a phrase to capture that which is coming up for you, but then see if, as you breathe in and out, you're willing to allow the story, a strong emotion, to be released to at whatever degree you might be holding on to it. As you breathe in and out, noticing what else is here. Continuing the scan, noticing if there's any tightness or just what sensations may be known within the shoulders, the arms, down through the hands. Such important energy centers, these hands, again, at various points during our conversation and even during this meditation, I've placed a hand over the heart. Sometimes we might place both hands over the heart when we're going through a moment of difficulty. And in these conversations about race and racism, not uncommon for us to have these moments of difficulty. If you are experiencing such a moment, the invitation might be to just acknowledge this is a moment of difficulty. I'm remembering, I'm seeing, I'm feeling, and then fill in the blank just enough to acknowledge your experience. And if you're willing, having acknowledged what is so for you in the way of difficulty that's coming up as you think about the interrelationship between awareness practices and compassion practices, and actually trying to make the world more just and less racist, frankly. As you feel what is coming up for you, noticing whatever is difficult, and just invite, if you're willing, awareness that you're not alone in this moment of difficulty, that this kind of challenge is something that other human beings are feeling right now, maybe not the exact same challenge because each of us is different, but some version of the pain and suffering and dissatisfaction and anger and rage and fear, vulnerability, fatigue, whatever it is for you, you're not alone as a human being feeling these kinds of feelings. Not now, you're not alone, and certainly across human history. So in other words, if you can allow these difficult feelings to be a bridge of, if you're willing to walk it, if you're willing to allow it, of connection with other human beings who have similarly had the courage to turn toward the painful consequences and ramifications of racism. We are not alone in this suffering. We are not alone in having the courage to look more deeply at racism. And we're not alone in doing what we can, as best we can, to disrupt the patterns of racism that impact us. Starting where we are. But as we notice the pain within us, the sorrow, the sadness, the anger, the rage, we might invite a kindness, a kind of invitation to bring that practice of metta, the experience of metta, of loving kindness, right in to support us. Lovingly, gently holding our experience in this moment. And inviting on the next in-breath, noticing what is well within you, what is strong, what is feeling the resources of being connected with other human beings who also care about these issues. Feeling the strength of that. And so as we bring in the kindness, the sort of invitation to wrap our own suffering in loving kindness, from this place, breathing in and breathing out, perhaps feeling a little bit more groundedness in the ability of these practices to help support us when we're going through difficult emotion. Feeling the ground beneath us, feeling the strength of the breath as you breathe in and out. Noticing what is well within us, what is strong, what is resourced, and the feeling of connectedness. So once again, perhaps on the next in-breath, deepening the sense of what is well and strong and resourced within us, and breathing out on the next out-breath, extending the wish for well-being to all those who are here in this moment of practice together. So breathing in what is well and strong and safe and connected. Breathing in a sense of the resources we have for this work. Breathing out the wish for well-being that includes for ourselves, we wish to be well and safe and strong. And we wish that for those who are suffering right now, who are experiencing racism in the interactions with immigration policies right now. We extend the wish for well-being to those who are experiencing racism in their public service work as teachers, as healthcare providers. Those who are struggling with the right use of their power as officers of the court, members of the legal profession, even police officers. The invitation then is to extend the wish for well-being to all those who are staring racism in the face and seeking to disrupt its awful temptations to domination, seeking to bring about a more just world. Now allowing those images and invitations to dissolve, and for the next few moments and minutes, allowing yourself to feel the support of your own practice, grounding in the sense of the value and preciousness of your own life, the power you have to make a difference based on the actions you take, and the way you choose to relate to the challenges in our time, including the racism in our midst. As we begin to bring this practice to a close, I want to invite, if you're willing, an engagement with these traditional phrases drawn from a loving kindness meditation that I will offer. And the invitation would be to inwardly repeat these to yourself, and perhaps extend the wish and the invitation to loving kindness beyond yourself to those who might be suffering even more in this moment. May we each and all be filled with loving kindness. May we be well. May you be well. May all those who are suffering be well in body and in mind. May we each and all be safe from inner and outer dangers. May all beings be truly joyful, easeful, and free. Thank you so much for your practice and for your presence. And may you be safe and be well.